Have with us Mr. Dan Stanton, former Executive Manager, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, also known as CSIS, as well as Mr. Artur Wilczynski, former Assistant Deputy Minister and Director General, Intelligence Operations, Communications Security Establishment, also known as CSE. You will each have up to 5 minutes for opening statements, after which we will proceed to questions from committee members. And what I'm going to do, just to keep it nice and tight, is Mr. Stanton, we'll start with yourself. And if you can just pass the floor to Mr. Wilczynski, then we'll just continue with questions after that. Welcome to committee. Mr. Stanton, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members of the committee. My reason for speaking today, and the message I'd like to get across, is that I do not agree with the decision not to have a public inquiry on the foreign interference allegations. And I'll address the rationale that's used to support that decision. Additionally, I do not want the onus falling to the opposition to push for a vote to have a public inquiry, but instead I wish to see the government and more particularly and respectfully the Prime Minister reconsider the decision not to have a public inquiry. The Special Rapporteur's review found, and I quote, "No examples of ministers, the Prime Minister or their offices knowingly or negligently failing to act on intelligence and advice or recommendations on the issues I have investigated." He focused on the machinery of government, the policymakers, and he did acknowledge that he found significant and concerning gaps in the sharing of intelligence and sensitive intelligence. He advised that the Minister of Public Safety does not have access to top-secret emails that national security officials use to share intelligence, including potential threats to members of Parliament. This has led to, and I quote, "situations where information that should be brought to the political level does not get there because it can be lost in the sea of material that floats through government." In the case of intelligence and the targeting of Member of Parliament Michael Chong, we're told from the review that while it was sent to the Public Safety Minister and his Chief of Staff, it was sent through a top-secret email system for which they lacked login details. So I ask respectfully, how can there not be indications of a failure to act on intelligence warnings when decision makers at public safety and a number of national security intelligence advisors never saw or were unable to access the reports? We're told that some of the allegations reported by the Globe and Mail and Global News were proven to be without foundation, were taken out of context. Which allegations? I think it's important to know that. Canada recently expelled a Chinese diplomat. Should we reconsider the PNG action? Security experts have advised the rapporteur, and he reported this, that we cannot have a public inquiry as it might upset the Five Eyes. Having worked with 9 of the 12 Five Eyes partners, human and SIGINT agencies, for many years, I can say with confidence that they have the highest regard for Canada's intelligence agencies and national security infrastructure. The Five Eyes have survived existential leaker damage from Kim Philby to Edward Snowden, and they have much bigger preoccupations with the China target than what could be considered our slightly more pedestrian but certainly domestic foreign interference investigation. Five Eyes reporting, and yes, I have no doubt there probably is some, can be sanitized for disclosure. Additionally, it can be reviewed either through witness testimony or through reports in camera at a public inquiry. So the Five Eyes is not a showstopper. The Five Eyes are not, like the Eye of Sauron, looking down at our public inquiry with grave concerns. We do have precedents for public inquiries on national security matters. We have Justice John Major's Commission inquiry in the bombing of Air India Flight 182, anniversary next month, by the way, where sensitive reporting and witness testimony were reviewed in camera. The same could be done with a public inquiry on foreign interference where the Attorney General of Canada can request the Commissioner to review sensitive information privately. Finally, I wish to address the issue of the question of privilege related to intimidation campaign against a Member of Parliament for Wellington, Halton Hills. I am very proud of my 30 years of service in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the work they do every day keeping Canadians safe. That said, I believe that when they received credible information that a member of Parliament's family members were being targeted by the People's Republic of China, he should have been apprised of that information on a priority basis. CSIS should have told Mr. Chong directly, rather than waiting for the machinery of government to fix their email problems. Thank you, Chair.
Merci Dan, merci Madame la Présidente. Je veux commencer par dire que
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll start by saying that foreign interference, as experienced by Mr. Chong and other MPs, is incompatible with democracy. Threats against members of Parliament are anathema and threaten the integrity of our democratic institutions, their ability to effectively represent Canadians. In his testimony, Mr. Chong outlined a series of critical questions in response to the threats posed by hostile state actors such as China and Russia. In his report, the special rapporteur also identified issues that affect Canada's ability to respond to foreign interference. Both raised essential questions, and I'll try to attempt to respond to those.
Consumer of intelligence. At Public Safety Canada and at Global Affairs Canada, as Director General, I consumed highly classified intelligence from across the Canadian intel community and from international partners. I engaged regularly with deputy ministers, and their staffs to discuss a wide range of issues. After serving as an ambassador, I returned to work at the Communications Security Establishment as the Director General for Intelligence Operations. I was asked to join CSE because of my years as a consumer of intelligence. Part of my mandate as DG Operations was to improve the experience of consumers of CSE's intelligence products. I was responsible for CSE's Client Relations Officer, or CRO program. I was also the chair of the Board of Governance of the Canadian Top Secret Network, the platform that provides access to highly classified intelligence to clients across government. Mon expérience m'a permis de mieux comprendre la...
My experience has given me a better understanding of the collection, analysis, dissemination, and use of intelligence. This is why I agree with many observers that say that the dissemination, consumption, and use of intelligence in Canada must be modernized. This is not a new issue. It was partly to address some of these challenges that I was appointed to the CSE. Unfortunately, it is still a work in progress.
Consumers have effective partnerships with producers, particularly personnel in the Canadian Armed Forces and other security organizations. There remain significant gaps. This unfinished business of modernization is why I was not shocked by Mr. Chong's experience or the observations shared by Mr. Johnston. They are familiar complaints of consumers of intelligence and require systemic response. My work was at CSE, Canada's Foreign Signals Intelligence Agency. Intelligence in Canada is produced by a wide range of actors, including CSIS, the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command, FINTRAC, CBSA, the Privy Council Office. It is complemented by classified diplomatic reporting from Global Affairs. That's just material generated by Canada. We also access intelligence from Five Eyes, NATO, and other arrangements. This is a vast information ecosystem. Ensuring the right people see the right information at the right time to make decisions in Canada's national interests is the goal. There is still much work to do to effectively achieve that self-evident objective. We invest heavily in collection of intelligence. We need to invest more in effective assessment and consumption. We need better coordination in the dissemination of intelligence. As a consumer of intelligence, it is difficult to prioritize classified information coming from multiple sources and at a volume that is almost impossible to effectively manage. Consumers of intelligence, whether ministers, their staffs, deputies, or other senior officials, need better training to understand what intelligence is, how to effectively use it in their decision-making process. We need a better intelligence culture in Canada. That culture is comparatively robust in addressing security threats to Canada and Canadians. It is far more tenuous when it comes to new and emerging issues, where new consumers have less experience with intelligence and are deciding how to allocate scarce time to reading highly classified material. We need greater transparency in intelligence, so Canadians better understand what it is and how it's used. We need greater coordination of dissemination processes. We need to value and empower the people that share that intelligence with clients and strengthen the systems used to do so. This should be the role of the Office of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the United States is an excellent model. While much can be done through policy change, I believe codifying the NSIA's role in law would help. Finally, I believe that deputy ministers should be more accountable for how their organizations use the intelligence they ask for. The accountability currently rests with collectors and assessors who respond to requirements set out by all of government. Consumers should be accountable for providing feedback and saying how the intelligence was used to achieve outcomes in the national interest. Much of that information will need to be classified, but these are important strategic fixes that I think will address some of the challenges raised by Mr. Chong and the Special Rapporteur. There are systemic challenges in our intelligence system. I hope we dedicate the time and resources to address them. Happy to share greater details on possible next steps with the committee. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for those opening comments. We appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. We'll now enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull, et puis Madame Goudreau, et puis Madame Blaney. Just a reminder, comments through the chair. Reminder, we have 2 official languages in Canada, so a pause between comments and responses would be appreciated. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Stanton through you, Madam Chair. You spoke in relation to the issues concerning Member of Parliament Michael Chong, that in the case of the Minister of Public Safety and senior officials in his office, that with respect to the sensitive email that had been sent in May of 2021, that they didn't have the login information and couldn't access the email. Now, Minister Blair was the minister for 18 months as of May of 2021. What does that say about the machinery of government that a minister who was in place for 18 months didn't have access to emails? Emails were being sent. CSIS was continuing to send those emails, and they were effectively going into a black hole. That doesn't seem to add up.
Well, that's exact. I mean, what inference we want to draw from that is you have all this sensitive reporting that is going into the system, which, and I'm quoting from the rapporteur's findings, that it's basically bobbing on a digital sea in computers. Maybe I'm being a little harsh, but it seems that there is a dearth of briefing up that's going on that you would expect with various departments would be done. Also sounds like a predilection for digital copies, and that, you know, hard copy briefings are kind of passé. And I think there's advantages actually in hard copy. But it does sound to me like CSIS is putting in these very sensitive reports, and there are these glitches and gaps, and they probably didn't start, you know, last year, that needed to be rectified so that that critical information would go at least the cabinet minister level to make his decision. So I have no idea why. It just strikes me as dysfunctional.
But ultimately, Madam Chair, through you, ultimately, what does that say about ministerial responsibility? I mean, ultimately, who bears responsibility? A minister is in place for 18 months.
Yeah.
The Minister of Public Safety, we have an email on a matter as critical as an accredited diplomat threatening and targeting a sitting member of Parliament, and the minister doesn't know about it because he doesn't have access.
Yeah. You know, just touching on a point that Mr. Wilczynski had mentioned, he talked about the rigorous review on the collection side. CSIS, CSE, CAF, others are subject to on an annual basis in terms of their performance and compliance with policy and that. I am suggesting that on the policymaker side, the machinery of government, we don't have the same type of review or accountability. It should be ministerial accountability. I think that's part of the bedrock of our parliamentary system, is where every department is responsible, and you would think there's mechanisms for briefing up, particularly in security and intelligence, such that you don't actually have to have a particular passcode to read a particular message. to factor that into your decision-making on something as critical as a threat to the members of Parliament.
Well, Madam Chair, through you to Mr. Stanton, after CSIS had sent that email in May, and it went into a black hole, and the minister didn't know, even though he had been minister for 18 months, CSIS then tries to, again, alert the minister, other departments, the PCO, when they prepared the July 2021 memo. And that went to the PCO, it went to the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, and yet apparently the Prime Minister didn't learn about that. Does that sound believable to you? And if the Prime Minister is in fact saying he had no idea, I mean, what does that say about the information flows and structures that he has in place to be briefed and be alerted to critical national security information?
I mean, it's not inspiring. The thing to appreciate is we talk about threat-related, and in this context, of course, the Member of Parliament. You know, a lot of threat-related intelligence, whether it's dealing with terrorism or espionage or things like that, they're already as a drill, or already as performance. They don't wait for CSIS to send assessments into that email system. So this would go in as an assessment piece on the foreign intelligence threat with all sorts of other information that probably goes in on a routine basis. And I've heard it said in the public, they say, well, why doesn't CSIS call, or why doesn't CSIS hint, you know, there's something in there? And what we don't want to have with security intelligence is where the agencies are shaping the narrative or saying to the policymakers, here, you must read that. So what I'm saying is I don't think that report went in to the system and that either the producers, CSIS, thought, okay, this needs immediate attention. It just goes in as a routine process on that. And I do find it disheartening because I spent, you know, 32 years in the business where you collect information, considerable risk and expense producing intelligence reports, and so you like to think that somebody read them or found them interesting. But perhaps what this initial review is revealing is those gaps are more significant than maybe we appreciated if reports are just floating around the system.
Yes, I'll give you.
Thanks very much. Just to add, I think it's really important to understand that both within the Department of Public Safety, where Minister Blair was the accountable minister, and again, I also agree with the concept of ministerial accountability, that there are structures. There is a branch responsible for national security that does receive regular, information and intelligence from CSIS and other agencies. It's the Deputy Minister of Public Safety that determines how much and what goes to ministers. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a massive volume that comes out every single day of intelligence products and assessments. Having a more robust engagement with clients like ministers, like deputies, so that the producers of intelligence better understand their needs and what needs to be brought to them urgently is something that is still weak in the government system and needs to be addressed.
Thank you. I know you're new to our committee, but we still use the old school mechanisms of the beep, 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 and that means time is up. But I think it's always suitable to have a response. And so I thank you, Mr. Cooper, for wanting Mr. Wilczynski to be able to also contribute. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to both the witnesses for being here today. Really appreciate your expertise and lending your perspective to this important conversation. I think you bring a lot to it. Mr. Stanton, maybe I'll start just with a question for you and follow up to Mr. Cooper's sort of line of questioning. Just wanted to know, so in this particular case that Mr. Cooper was speaking about, where we're sort of inferring things from what the Right Honourable David Johnston has reported on in his report, and what he's able to say and what he's able to report are based on obviously lots of classified intelligence that he's been able to review. Are you intimately aware and knowledgeable about those specific allegations in terms of your, because you bring a lot of expertise to the conversation, but there's a part of me that's assuming you don't exactly have the detailed information that David Johnston's been able to review. Am I right on that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so that's helpful because I think, you're not I wouldn't put you in a position to confirm or deny certain things that you don't have knowledge of. I think that's putting you in an unfair, compromising position. So, but I do think this conversation has sort of become overly partisan in a lot of our dealings on the Hill with foreign interference. And it's such an important conversation to be had. And I think, you know, the report from David Johnston, which I've reviewed thoroughly multiple times now, you know, really points to areas where I think we need to see improvements. And I think, at least from this side, the government side, you know, we sit here around the table hoping that we're going to get to the detailed, you know, good faith suggestions that that can improve our system of intelligence. And I think the big thing that comes up in the report for me is that the way in which information is dealt with and coordinated and how it's fed up and how it's used to make decision making. So, Mr. Stanton, maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Wilczynski, Mr. Wilczynski, and hope I'm saying your last name right. But maybe you could give us some of your sentiments on that, and then we'll go to Mr. Wilczynski.
Well, thanks for asking that, Mr. Turnbull, because I wouldn't want anyone to interpret my comments in any way as in a partisan way, because I'm the antithesis of that, and that's why I don't want to vote in the House. I'm trying to avoid what would be a divisive vote. I raised the issue of these gaps and the email system and such in the context that we're hearing from the reviewer, Mr. Johnston, that there was no sign of either, I don't know, interference or negligence or anything like that in reaction to the reporting. And so I'm simply saying, how can you make those conclusions when the policymakers that are making these decisions didn't see, hear, read, or find a report? So with these gaps in the system of being briefed, how do we reach the conclusion that the decision makers carried out their decisions in a way that was either competent or devoid of that? So I didn't mean in a partisan way, but in the initial question you had with me, no, I have no insight on that side of the House. I spent my whole life in what was called collection, in field and headquarters of collecting reporting, sending it over to the consumers of reporting. So I have no insight into the system, whether it works. I'm simply going by what Mr. Johnston publicly disclosed. He found and he acknowledged were serious and significant gaps in the sharing of intelligence.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. I know you've made some pretty important comments in your opening remarks on how we can better deal with the flow and modernize the flow of information, how it's coordinated through the intelligence agencies to the appropriate ministries and ministers who are ultimately accountable. Can you speak to how we can improve that?
Sure. I think there's a number of ways that we can improve that. First, I think we need to make sure that all government departments have access to that top secret network so that they can receive that information. I think that the way that that access is managed in those departments needs to be from a policy perspective and a response perspective, as opposed to a technical departmental security point of view, which is how it's managed right now. I also think that we need to modernize and improve the coordination of the client relations officers. Those are the human beings that meet with clients around government to make sure that they get the information at the right time. At the moment, there's too few of them. At the moment, they are employed by the communications security establishment. They were my former colleagues, and again, they reported to me, even though they're providing a whole of government service in many cases. They need to be more of them. They need to be better trained. In my opinion, they need to be at a more senior level when they're meeting with deputies and other senior officials in order to make sure that they have the ability to engage. And I also think that another important element is ensuring feedback, that when consumers read the intelligence, that they tell the collectors whether or not it is in fact the information that they're seeking. Because part of the challenge is making sure that people spend time on the intelligence, and too often when it isn't what consumers want, there is no feedback that's provided, and that affects the volume of information that goes to key clients, which I think is part of the problem with the system as it exists.
Well, we've heard, about some people going into a room with a very large binder of intelligence that they're supposed to review and being given no direction as to what is relevant in that binder. And I could just imagine if myself were in that person's shoes, you aren't given the adequate time to actually review the material, first of all, and you don't necessarily know how to, like, there's a number of skills, I imagine, that you need to have. Like, how long, Mr. Wilczynski, would it have taken you to be able to interpret intelligence in a way that you feel confident about what actions you would take as a result?
So as a consumer, it takes years to actually get an understanding, I think, of the information in front of you. And you need, I think, regular engagement with a range of actors to be effective in turning that information that you see into actual effective decision making, which is why I say we need to change the intelligence culture in this country, where we need to speak more frankly with Parliament, with parliamentarians. We need to speak more often with Canadians about what intelligence is, so that when they are elected to represent us here in this House of Commons, that you have a basic understanding of how intelligence works.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Madame Goudreau. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I wanted to say that I feel reassured by what you're saying, because since November 7th, we've been concerned and we've been trying through every means to shed light on this matter. And when I hear you say that there is no justification not to have a public independent investigation, when I hear everything that's already been done, when I hear that it's been over 30 years that you've been working in this field, my question is this. Why, I mean, you said it yourselves, why do we not have an independent public investigation at this point? Why do you think?
Well, I can't answer the reason why, but I do feel it's very, very important. I feel there's increasing distrust in Canada in terms of our democratic institutions. And look, I was at the other committee on the 10th of April. If you would have asked me then, I would have said, no, we don't need a public inquiry. I don't think it's necessary. And I come in with all sorts of security reasons for it. But since then, there's been so much reporting, and even assuming a percentage of the reporting has some truth, I'm usually not someone who believes in either conspiracy theories, or I'll always give someone the benefit of the doubt. I keep thinking, there may still be some negligence. I think maybe there is, but I think Canadians are increasingly wondering what's going on. And I think, and that's why I am. I want a public inquiry because I want Canadians to regain that trust in their institutions. And I'm sad about that. When I had a performance agreement as an executive manager in the service, our first priority that we had to sign off on was the protection of Canada's democratic institutions and processes. That was it, and we were evaluated on that. And all I've been hearing the last couple of years is how Canadians are increasingly becoming less and less trusting in their system, and that's why I want an inquiry.
In fact, I have a question on this, because now we're really focusing on trust in our democratic system. And essentially, I'd like to get back to some terms. Like on May 23rd, there was mention of the special rapporteur as to whether he was best placed to do the work, and whether it would be legitimate to build national consensus and therefore protect public trust and democratic institutions. Do you have concerns that without a public inquiry, what we're trying to regain, that trust, tell me a bit more about that. You know, that is concerning. To me, it's very concerning, as you said. It's also been mentioned by the special rapporteur. Democracy is a matter of confidence. The Prime Minister himself has repeated that, and on the basis of the facts we have before us, there's a consensus that seems to be established that there needs to be this independent investigation. It's important to have it because it's a means to build that trust. Without trust, there is no democracy. There can be no common institutions. We need to do everything in our power to clarify what happened over the last elections, but also we need a transparent process to be prepared for threats that exist and will evolve over the coming years. I agree with my colleague. The best way to do this is through an independent investigation. I have time for one more question. When we hear that there is resistance to a public investigation because we want to protect our national security, when I hear that you're mentioning the Five Eyes as saying, you know, this is déjà vu, what further information can we provide to the government for it to act? Because you know, in the House of Commons even, there was a vote so that this independent public investigation go ahead. Opposition parties are on board. What's missing here? To me, it's not about classified information being processed by the special rapporteur or an independent investigation. As my colleague has said during his testimony, there are examples of public investigations where we have processed and reviewed very highly classified documents, and that's one way for our allies and our colleagues in the Five Eyes to fully understand the importance. They understand the importance of transparency in this issue, in this area, and they have the same procedures on their side. So my issue is that it's not an issue of security, classification of documents. It has to do with political will. You just answered a very good question. I'd like to hear you, sir.
When you look at inquiries, for example, the John Major inquiry, you talk about security and sensitivity of information. There were surveillance questioned, there were intelligence officers, deputy ministers, there were former ambassadors, there was a whole smorgasbord of people that were questioned. When I look at the nature of this investigation, and I worked this area for years, most of my career is in counterintelligence, foreign interference is what we refer to as low-hanging fruit. Okay, this isn't an espionage ring. This isn't like of great sensitivity. And I'm not understating it. I probably have former colleagues asking me what I'm doing, but it's not that sensitive. It's already out that CSIS uses interviews, and it's in the media that CSIS listens to phones of targets. Okay, so there's not going to be that much coming out that's going to shake Western civilization, not to be facetious. And that's why I say if we want to have an inquiry, it's probably the safest one in terms of national security to have on this type of operation.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Et à vous.
Thanks to you, Madam Blaney.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. And I'm really finding this interaction very interesting. And I share your concerns about the fact that so many Canadians are losing faith in our democratic institutions, and that worries me. And I think it worries all of us, hopefully, in this place. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is it seems like the debate right now is if the special rapporteur should or should not have the job. And I feel like this is not what we should be focusing on. We need to actually be focusing on the issues and getting to that. So it seems like this is a bit of a barrier to that, and that concerns me. So I guess my first question is both of you, and to both of you, talked a little bit about how information should have been given to Mr. Chong more effectively and more quickly. And of course, I know that I also have a member of my caucus that's facing the same or similar challenge of just not having that information. So if you could, from your expertise, just share with us, is this a legislative gap? Is it a process gap? What is preventing information? Because it seems strange to me, and it sounds like our legislative rules say it has to go to the minister and then the minister decides. But it seems to me that if a member of parliament, if a candidate during an election is targeted, they need to know that information, and them not having that information is an issue of security. So I'm just wondering.
Let me address that, because I've actually had that experience. I've spoken to, in the past, members of parliament on this type of issue. And what it is, when the service does these interviews, there's a certain amount they can disclose. Like I'm talking to you, I'm going to actually have to tell you who I am, and then you're going to tell me things. So it's a bit of a back and forth of information getting. But then when there's information that comes in, and perhaps some of the information that came in on Mr. Chong, it's not really been assessed necessarily as credible. It could have come from a source of unknown reliability. It could have come from some other party or something. So it's not like the moment the service gets that information, they're going to go to that member of parliament and say, look, we understand you're this. They have to assess that. And the process of assessing could be a number of interviews with that subject. I did in my final word say when the service obviously understood that since this was accurate, that some entity in the PRC was targeting him, they should have told him. But they don't always have the luxury of that accurate, full picture as the threat is unfolding. And so I don't know what the mechanism is other than have trust in the intelligence service that they will know when it's reaching a point they should act or turn it over to policymakers.
And I'm going to let you answer, I promise, but I just want to add clarity to that. So I hear what you're saying is it has to be something tangible to pass that on. But who gets to decide who passes that on? That seems to be the challenge.
Well, that's the point. It looks to me, I mean, I wasn't part of the process. It looks to me like the service was sending these reports routinely for quite some time, and that there's an expectation that the policymakers or the machinery of government has a strategy to deal with PRC foreign interference and would incorporate that in their decision. That's the whole point. It's not hitting tripwires like terrorism and espionage, but it is hitting tripwires. And so if there's a certain lethargy with government in terms of receiving the reporting, it's not a surprise to me when it starts getting a little more serious with respect to an MP that there's nobody home. And it goes to culture, which my colleague had mentioned earlier. There may simply just be a culture where they don't respond to the reporting. But CSIS isn't waiting by the phone. They're just continually putting this out as part of the intelligence production process.
Thank you. Mr. Wilczynski.
Yeah, I was just going to add that what is, I think, an important conversation to have are exactly what are the thresholds for that reporting. And as my colleague, Mr. Stanton, pointed out, like you really do need an assessed understanding of what the threat is as opposed to any kind of information that may be in the domain that comes to the attention of intelligence services that names or addresses a specific member of parliament. The challenge if you do that, if you have this open-ended, anytime anyone says anything about an MP, you're actually opening yourself up to a whole new threat vector in terms of disinformation, misdirection, information campaigns. So I think that there does need to be an exercise of judgment around when that happens, and it has to really be based on an assessment of what is the level of threat to that member of parliament or any other Canadian, where some kind of engagement with that individual who is targeted would help them manage the risk, or if there is another course of action that would be more appropriate that, again, mitigates the risk to them and to, in the case of members of parliament, to this institution.
So it just appears to me that there's a little bit of a void, and I really, Mr. Wilczynski, appreciated what you said about that conversation back and forth and that that's not happening in the way that it should. So I'm just wondering if you could explain from your perspective who is responsible for establishing protocols around sharing of intelligence, information from intelligence agencies to government, and is there a gap there between that and how the departments and the ministers take that information?
So government identifies its intelligence priorities. That is a cabinet process that tells the intelligence communities, go forth and get us intelligence. There's a level of opacity in that process that I think is challenging. And I think that there is scope for making how government decides what our intelligence priorities are more transparent to Parliament and more transparent to Canadians. When those priorities are identified, we then understand who needs it and then work very hard to ensure that the people that asked for that intelligence get it. The problem is, as I pointed out in my statement, oftentimes we don't hear back from deputies and senior officials or ministers. Are we getting what you need? And that's why I said that interface needs to be improved, and there's a role for the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to strengthen that process.
Thank you.
We'll now do a quick round. 5 minutes à Monsieur Berthold, suivi par...
Mr. Berthold, you'll have 5 minutes, and Madame Romanado, then Madame Bidreau, 2.5 minutes, then Madame Blaney, and then the second panel. Mr. Berthold. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Stanton, you made some public statements over Twitter stating quite directly that you're in favor of a independent national investigation on what we're calling foreign interference. You've been vocal about this. It's quite unusual for someone who's been in your position in the past to make that kind of statement. Why is it that all these other processes, like what's going on here, the proposals for public hearings, why do you think these are not the best vehicles?
Well, it's a good question. There are good vehicles. The thing with the parliamentary committees such as NISRA and NISCOP, their prime work, and they do excellent work, is they review the compliance of the collector agencies. That's what I guess you could say almost hard driven to, is focusing on that, not so much focusing on the machinery of government and how they're handling things. Now, there's obviously merit in having that. But what I am sensing, mostly through media, mostly through parliamentarians and everything else, is that a lot of Canadians are getting frustrated or agitated to find out if there's any clarity to this. And then we also have the concerns with leaking. I am very much against the leaking, and part of the reason I'm speaking publicly, and part of the reason I'm saying I'd like to have an inquiry, is I'd like to see the leaking stop as well. So it is kind of odd for me, as the security guy, to be saying, let's have an open hearing. It's kind of against my DNA in a way, but my mind tells me that that's the best route to go right now, because I don't think a lot of people want to wait a couple years.
Vous avez dit, Monsieur Stanton, que
Mr. Stanton, you said that a public investigation could review intelligence in specific cases, and that a public investigation would not be a fetter to our operations, to our relationships with other Five Eyes countries, specifically given the subject matter here. This committee has asked for the production of documents from or about all of the aspects that were leaked. You know, we'd like copies of emails or anything else that would be submitted to the clerk, rather to the, what is it called again? The law clerk of the office of the law clerk? To be redacted. Do you think parliamentarians, have the right and should have access to these documents to shed light on this fully?
une fois
Once it's been reviewed by the law clerk.
I believe it ultimately. If ultimately the answers are going to come from cabinet conferences or that type of email exchanges, it would. But I'm aware of the fact of the sensitivity. And that's why I'm saying with a public inquiry, you can still have those in-camera discussions or exchanges with the commissioner. There's no lawyers, anyone there. They can just review it and get some answers. It's not an either-or thing. We either have a public inquiry and we can't talk about classified matters at all, which means it's going to be pointless, or we just stick with the regular institutions we have to review it. And then the public says, well, how do we know it was reviewed? And that's why, in my opinion, it's a public inquiry. But you can put all sorts of safeguards on public inquiries. It just takes a little bit of creativity. It's all legal. It's been done before.
Est-ce que vous croyez qu'on peut également faire
Do you think we can be creative in the same way when this particular parliamentary committee asks for this information? Do you think the various groups, national security, can also be protected by the system in place?
That's a tough one. I don't have a legal background on it. I'm just speaking in terms of a public inquiry, and there's precedence for public inquiries. We've had them on national security matters. So that's why I don't feel like we're really reinventing the wheel. But when you get into those issues, can parliamentarians demand those documents? You're asking the wrong person.
allez-y.
Quickly, just to address specifically that question, can the law clerk do those redactions so that parliamentarians can see the documents? The answer is going to be no, because you need someone with the appropriate security clearance that has the necessary. You're saying that a law clerk does not have this authority? Look, I'm not aware of him having that level of clearance. That's something that is issued by the executive power, and we need to see who actually can draft these things just to make sure there is transparency. And I agree with my colleague, and that's also why I'm in favor of a public inquiry, because they have the capacity and the authority to look at the documents entirely. Question, just for some information, the law clerk told us, sorry, that's a debate, says the chair, and we've heard the beep beep. And I gave you plenty of time. I appreciate the comments, and if there is anything further, you can always share that. Now let's move to Madame Romanado. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I want to follow up on a little bit of some of the questionings we've heard today. Gentlemen, in your expertise, I'm hearing a lot of the same conclusions that are actually identified in the Special Rapporteur's report with respect to the governance of the communication between the intelligence community and the machine of government. And there has been, this problem has been identified, and you've alluded to it as well. Mr. Wilczynski, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly. You brought up a very interesting topic about education, about training people to understand what is intelligence, what is evidence, and it takes years to be a consumer and understand completely what intelligence is. Full disclosure, my son is an intelligence officer with Canadian Armed Forces, and trust me, we do not have conversations around the kitchen table. However, in Mr. Johnston's report, he clarified very clearly that he had access to cabinet information, that he had access to top secret information, and that his conclusions are based on evidence, and that in the annex, he includes a top secret reference, which shows how he got to where he got to in terms of his decision. He has also offered the leaders of the opposition to have access to get the top secret clearance, to get access to the same information, so parliamentarians can see this, to determine for themselves whether or not his conclusions were sound. They may not agree with the conclusions, and they can say publicly that they don't agree. However, they've been offered that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they should take the special rapporteur and the government up on those offers. I think that it's important, if we're going to have a conversation about foreign interference, that all individuals, leaders who have the opportunity to and who will influence the way Canadians think about it, to be as informed as possible. And I do believe it is very possible for individuals who see that intelligence and who review it to actually offer some particular insight about it. Mr. Johnston put out a public report. It contains numerous pages commenting about the specifics of those reports, and I think that that's important to note, and that individuals on all sides of the House should have, and all sides of the issue should have the understanding that they too can pass judgment on what they see. But that said, it's also, in my opinion, a bit of a moot point, and the reason why I say that is because personally, I have no reason to doubt and in no way, shape, or form question Mr. Johnston's conclusions. I have immense respect for him as an individual and as a public servant who's dedicated years to this country. But it's not me that he's trying to, or he should try to convince. It is a threshold of Canadians, and I'm worried that that's what's being compromised right now.
So actually, on that note, that's where I wanted to go with this. I think honestly that this is going to be a multi-pronged approach. We have NSICOP looking into this. We have the Special Rapporteur looking into this. We have NCIRA looking into this. We have PROC looking into this. We have multiple branches looking into this issue. And the Special Rapporteur also mentioned that in terms of bringing back confidence to the Canadian public, that is why he wants to do outreach with the community to explain to people what is intelligence, what is evidence, how can you too play a part in terms of recognizing something, where should you bring that information as intelligence officers, yourselves, pieces of information help bring the portrait to light. And there are many ways to capture this information. So whether it be discussing with MPs individually when they see something that maybe they should be reporting. So would you not say that what the Special Rapporteur is doing and proposing to do can instill some more faith in the Canadian public who are concerned by also educating them what it is?
Again, I am very happy anytime Canadians speak about national security matters, because we almost never do. And I think that the consequences of that, in my humble submission, are that we have not had a productive conversation about the threat that Canada is facing. So again, Would his, bringing attention to various issues help? Yes. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's the issue. The end of the day is how do you restore the trust and faith of Canadians in democratic institutions, and what is the process to get us there? All the technicalities that we talk about, I got pages of recommendations I can share with you. Those are moot if Canadians don't trust. And I think that needs to be the single objective of government, is how do we restore trust? And I'm afraid when you have the kind of partisanship that we see, that does not contribute to that outcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Merci, Madame. Thank you, Madam Chair. Have I understood this correctly? The correlation between whether there is not a public investigation called, that leaks are going to be ongoing? Is that what I heard as a concern?
No, I didn't say that's going to happen. I'm saying I would like to see the leaks stop. That's the reason I'm doing it. And I think the leakers are probably playing on that distrust, right?
Just going to pause for a second, and because we just don't have interpretation, so I want to make sure that it is working now. It is working now. Let's just start that all over again. So from the top, Madame Goudreau.
Mais moi, je vais me reprendre. So I'll say that again. Your concern, is it that the public investigation will mean that these leaks will be ongoing? Because this is what we've been seeing since November, correct?
No, I mean, I have no insight into whether the leaks are going to continue or whether they've stopped. I'm simply hoping they are. I'm simply saying is that the distrust that a lot of Canadians are having in those in their institutions is creating a kind of nobility among the leakers, which I disagree with. So there's this whole idea that the leakers are whistleblowers and are going to save the country from ruin. And so this not having an inquiry, calling the leakers all malign actors, saying that the journalists are all gullible, I don't think is an intelligent strategy to stop the leakers. That's my opinion.
Je vous remercie. Thank you. I'd like to also hear, I have 1 minute left. Sir, today, given the expertise you have, what are the steps that are really critical to restore confidence, to restore trust? To me, to my mind, it's important to have an independent investigation that is managed, presided over by a former judge, where there is absolutely no issue to the credibility or reliability of that individual. That's a first step. That's necessary, but not sufficient. The investigation, is one thing, but the results really matter. It's important to implement measures to counter foreign interference, because if we take for granted people's motivations, these leakers' motivations, well, the investigation is only a process to identify ideas and processes. If the implementation is the critical aspect, I myself, like my colleague, have no idea about the results. But I would not be surprised to have ongoing leaks, even if there is an investigation, even if an inquiry, because it's not the inquiry that matters, it's the actions that matter.
En complément?
Anything to add?
Nope.
Anything you want to add?
Donc, ce que je comprends.
From what I'm gathering, Madam Chair, at the end of the day, with everything that's in place, it is important to get to that end. That is the importance of having an independent public inquiry.
Madame Blaney.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Wilczynski, just about the production of papers. I can't tell you how many hours I've met with people to talk about the production of papers, wanting to make sure that whatever we request is actually as safe as possible. You talked a little bit about the law clerk. I'm just wondering, the way that we could get papers redacted in the process that is in place, is that not sufficient? There seems to be a distrust from some members of the committee, and I'm just wondering, could you share, is that Is that something we should be concerned about?
I'm concerned about the security of information broadly. I'm a former departmental security officer. I know, I should say this up front, I've spent many years as a political staffer back in the 80s and early 90s too. So I know a lot about how this place works. And my concern would be around information security and information integrity. And when we're talking about highly classified...
On pause.
Comment inaudible.
Is there still feedback, or is it okay when we're speaking? There is still feedback. We can feedback. Is there something we can do to
Je peux le
correct?
répéter en français aussi, après, si vous
on essaie d'avoir un système qui fonctionne dans les deux langues. Donc, la langue que la question est posée, si on peut répondre dans cette langue-là.
So, if you can answer in the language in which the question is posed, that would be ideal.
The system to work. You're not getting any feedback when I speak? Is it maybe just her earphone, Madame Gaudreau? Do you still hear feedback? We are okay, so it's all good. Excellent. Mrs. Blaney, if you want to summarize your question again, or if you're okay with just going to the answer, that's fine.
Summarize? He's got it.
A little bit hesitant on more than a little bit hesitant on that process. It is around information security. We're talking about highly classified documents. We have obligations in terms of protecting the information, and I think that we need to be as robust in the protection of that information as possible, which is one of the reasons, and much like my colleague, I believe fundamentally that there are institutions in Canada that can independently look at this information in as transparent a way as possible, that have both the physical means to do so in terms of safe, secure rooms, as well as the technology to do so. I have yet to experience that level of security for highly classified documents when it comes to this place. I'm sorry to say. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but again, in terms of my job was always managing risk, and I think that in terms of protection of the information is too high a risk. Again, why I think an inquiry which has the individuals and the facilities to appropriately handle the information is the right way to go. I understand that lots of committees are looking at it, but my preference from a security perspective is that inquiry process because it has the means to manage that information.
Thank you. I've only got 10 seconds left, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. So
Madame
I
la
will just
Présidente,
say
j'ai vraiment le souci.
Madam Chair, I'm really concerned. Are we still hearing any feedback?
First, to be reminded that your earpiece should not be near the microphone, and that might be the cause of some of that feedback. I do find it interesting that the feedback is not evenly shared throughout the room, but there is different systems. So it could be it's impacting one more than the other. But Madame Gaudreau, the concerns have been noted, and they are being looked into. As you can tell, our IT guru is on his feet, very concerned and wanting to respond to this. Mr. Cooper, before
30 seconds.
can you try for 10?
You can
go ahead. Just
let
give me your
witnesses-
10 seconds.
Okay.
What would you like?
Madam Chair, before we move on to the next panel, I note that a letter was sent to you, signed by all members of the opposition on this committee on May 19th, requesting that Minister Blair appear for 2 hours. I see that he is coming to committee, but only for 1 hour. Given the troubling reports that he differed for 4 months to sign off on surveilling an Ontario Liberal cabinet minister, as well as the very troubling information that sensitive information concerning MP Chong essentially went into a black hole because he didn't have the sign-in authority after being minister for 18 months. I would say there's many questions, and the minister has a lot to answer for. So I would just ask that, or if you could address, Chair, his availability for 1 hour versus 2. And I know you don't control the minister's schedule, but...
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. There's a lot of things that I and none of us do control. So as you know, our resources are very limited. As you know, PROC is to meet for 4 hours a week. As you know, we're meeting for a lot more than that. So we're also juggling who has committed and who has not. So the motion that was presented to this committee did not provide me a lot of leniency, so I respect that. We did get Jody Thomas to commit to her 2 hours. Because we got an extra hour, Mr. Blair is able to give us an hour. We can always work on getting them back and so forth. But I'm working at trying to put in puzzle pieces in a schedule that's challenging. And I'm sure that some might know that perhaps in the House Commons right now, there's someone standing on a question of privilege, which will come to this committee. I'm trying to manage what our focus and our priority is every single day because it's continuously changing. And so for us, it's difficult. So I hear you, the letters you write to me, I read in both official languages, and I always enjoy reading them. You don't have to send so many, but when you do, I do hold them close to my heart. So right now, we've got the National Security Intelligence Advisor, who we want doing important work in keeping our country safe, appearing for 2 hours. We've got Mr. Blair appearing for 1 hour. You want him for a second hour. We will try to do our best to make that happen. Minister Mendicino's office has responded back to confirm where we can make his schedule work with our schedule work. Minister Joly has also been doing it. So we're just kind of in this multi-ring circus. But rest assured, reassured, Mr. Cooper, that I take your request very seriously and I'll do whatever I can. With that, Mr. Stanton, Mr. Wilczynski, we really appreciated your insights today. At least I did. I've been watching you at other committees. I like this this duo you've got going on, so it might go really far. I also noticed that you, the CSE and the CSIS, things that happen after retirement that might not happen when we're serving, but maybe it will be contagious. I would just say to you, you did mention certain documents and just additional insights. If you could share those with the clerk, we will have them put in both official languages and shared with everything else. If later on tonight you're like, oh, I wish I had said that or I should have added this, do not hesitate to send it to us tomorrow or the next day. We welcome any insights you have. And if you ever want to come back to PROC, once again, just make a request, but we might beat you to it. So with that, we wish you a really good day. Our next panel has one person who's video conference will do a sound test today, Mr. Andrew Mitrovica by video conference, as well as Mr. Michael Wernick, who is joining us in person. Both are reappearing to this committee, so we appreciate you coming back on our request. You will have up to 5 minutes for your opening comments, and we will commence with Mr. Mitrovica. Welcome back. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, bon après-midi. 3 weeks ago, I reluctantly appeared before this committee to try to say something of value that might help you and Canadians navigate reports about Chinese interference, a matter that I once spent a lot of time reporting about as an investigative journalist. I came here reluctantly because, as I suspected, while members of this committee listened to what I had to say, I came away convinced that several of you didn't hear what I had to say. That's an important distinction. I know that you listen to what witnesses like me have to say through the prism of politics, and then decide if it has any political currency or not. I get it. Politics is what you do. I like to think that as an investigative reporter, getting at the truth is what I do. So please hear me out. Last time I was here, I said several things that I believe are relevant to the serious matter at hand, which requires serious people to do serious thinking about, not posturing, thinking. First, I reminded the committee, Canadians, and my colleagues in the Fourth Estate, many of whom have suddenly fallen deeply and madly in love with an intelligence service they know nothing about, that beyond the ineptness and racism inside CSIS, intelligence officers make big mistakes all the time about a lot of important stuff. These are as well the same invisible intelligence officers who a federal court judge slammed in 2020 for having, quote, a degree of institutional disregard for, or at the very least, a cavalier institutional approach to, the duty of candor and, regrettably, the rule of law. In other words, CSIS doesn't always tell the truth, and it breaks the law. That fact, I suspect, might be news to most of you, and too many starry-eyed reporters, editors, and columnists who don't have a clue about how CSIS operates. With that caveat in mind, I urge the committee, Canadians, and my colleagues to treat cautiously and skeptically the drip-by-drip bits of information being leaked by what likely amounts to a handful of members of Canada's largely unaccountable security intelligence structure. I also reminded the committee that so-called intelligence, which is just an eye-catching word for information, is neither evidence or proof. And that information has to be considered in context. It has to be corroborated, and that it can be embellished and edited to fit a narrative that can bear little resemblance to the truth, particularly when it is leaked by intelligence officers who, dare I say, may have an agenda and who know, one, the top secret information can be spun to their parochial benefit, two, that they can leverage reporters to be spun and who in turn talk their stories to make a bigger splash to the delight of those intelligence officers. Still, perhaps the most important point I made was that the leaks have caused deep harm to some of our fellow Canadians by raising spurious questions about their loyalty to the Maple Leaf. And these few intelligence officers who prefer to do their handiwork in the comfortable shadows know they will get away with the damage they have done to Canadians of Chinese descent who love this country too. Why? Because they always get away with it. Last week in his report, the special rapporteur confirmed the main thrust of what I told you 3 weeks ago. David Johnston is not my pal. I don't live near him. I'm not a member of any foundation he is a member of. In fact, I'm not a member of any foundation at all. Also, anyone familiar with my writing about the current Prime Minister would never confuse me of being a liberal lackey. Mr. Johnston was right when he wrote that a lot of reporting fueled by these selective leaks involved, quote, unsubstantiated speculation, limited intelligence, a lack of context, and finally, when information about foreign interference is provided without care or context, it can cause the public narrative to turn on communities. Ask Hang Dong about the damage that can be done when this happens. A television news outlet tarred Mr. Dong as in effect a traitor, and Mr. Johnston found that egregious, life-altering charge was absolutely, categorically, emphatically false. We are witnessing Mayor Artur the sequel. This sinister stuff has a familiar ring. A former CSIS director and national security advisor to another prime minister publicly peddled the same insinuations in 2010. It's ironic that in an editorial at the time, the Globe and Mail denounced his remarks as reckless and foolish. The same could be said today about the newspaper itself. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Mitrovica. I know, Mr. Wernick, that you don't have comments, but I would like to pass the floor to you just to say a quick hello and set the stage. Mr. Wernick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm very happy to give you a second hour at your invitation. No, I have no opening statement. I would just be repeating the past appearance, which was before we did all get the chance to read Mr. Johnston's report. My takeaway message is the same as last time. I think it is time for you as legislators to step up and start legislating. I'd be happy to talk about what could go in it.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. We will now start with 6-minute rounds, beginning with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota, Madame Goudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours. Comments through the chair, pausing in between comments and answers for the sake of our interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Wernick through you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wernick, you served as the Clerk of Privy Council, and in having been in that role, were you surprised that the National Security Advisor confirmed that the PCO had received a CSIS memo regarding the Beijing intimidation campaign targeting Michael Chong in July of 2021, and that Michael Chong was never informed about it, learned about it through the Globe and Mail, and secondly, that the Prime Minister apparently, at least according to his word, had no idea about it and also learned about it through the media?
Well, Mr. Cooper, as I said the last time, I left government 4 years ago. I have no calendars, no secret documents, no records. I was not one of the 32 people that Mr. Johnston interviewed, and I don't have access to the documents that he saw, so I'd be speculating.
Asking, I recognize that you were not there in July of 2021, but you did say the last time that you appeared before this committee that you were not aware of anyone in the PCO ever withholding national security information from the Prime Minister. Do you stand by that?
I am not aware. I don't recall anybody willfully withholding information. There may have been inadvertent gaps in information being passed from one person to another. I think Mr. Johnston writes about that in his report.
And you would acknowledge that an intelligence memo citing an accredited Beijing diplomat targeting a sitting member of Parliament by threatening the safety and security of his family in Hong Kong is a serious matter. You would agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think it's Prime Minister worthy. It should have gone to the Prime Minister.
It should have gone to the Prime Minister, and so therefore you would have been you were surprised that it didn't, or does that ring true? I guess I'm not asking you. You weren't there, but you were in the role. You did say information regularly flows to the Prime Minister. So how is it possible that that information, as serious as that, would not have been passed on to the Prime Minister?
That's the part I don't know. I mean, Mr. Johnston interviewed 32 people, including everybody, presumably, who was in that chain of meetings and documents. My view, just reading the Johnston report and media clippings, is that's the kind of thing that a Prime Minister should be made aware of.
Okay. Thank you for that. Besides, well, perhaps you could explain who likely in the PCO would have received a memo such as that.
I'd be going back over Mr. Jean's testimony, I think, but the basis of it is that the National Security and Intelligence Advisor acts as a coordinator among the various security and intelligence agencies. Information flows into the NSIA, part of the Privy Council office, and they make decisions about what to give to various people on their client list and who has the appropriate clearance and who would be interested in particular topics. So that judgment would be exercised somewhere within the NSIA branch of PCO. As clerk, I was copied on documents. I met with the NSIA regularly, I would say roughly once a week. And I left the onus on the NSIA to tell me things that he or she thought I needed to know.
Okay. Changing gears a little bit, Madam Chair, to Mr. Wernick. Can you explain a little bit about the types of information received by PCO with respect to keeping transmission records? Can you explain how these transmission records are produced and stored?
Well, I can't speak to anything after April 2019. They may have completely rewired or automated the system.
When you were there up until April of 2019.
It may have been given to an AI chatbot now. I have no idea how it works now. But what we did in the Privy Council office is we kept track of what we were sending, and I know that the Prime Minister's office kept track of what they were receiving. And there were people in the Privy Council office attached to the clerk's office who did a lot of what we called chasing, and they would keep track of documents. They had dates, they had numbers, there was a log. There were basically two kinds of information passed downstairs. Some of it was for information, and you were not seeking a decision, and some of it was for decision, went to the Prime Minister, and those were the ones that we spent the most time chasing and trying to get what's called a PM return, the Prime Minister's decision, yes, no, maybe, I want to see more work, that kind of thing. So there were people in the clerk's office and there were people in the Prime Minister's office who were document chasers.
And in your view, would it be difficult for transmission records to be provided to this committee? Would that be a difficult undertaking from your experience up until April of 2019?
I think you would have to ask the current management at PCO. I think it's possible to provide logs that are redacted for sometimes there's information that you would want to withhold the fact that the Prime Minister was sent something or met with somebody and so on. But there's undoubtedly some way to do that, and that's I mean, just to jump ahead a little bit, that's why bodies like the Review Agency and NSI COP and the federal court and Mr. Johnston's inquiry do get access to that kind of document when they ask for it.
Thank you.
Mrs. Sahota.
Madam Chair. I guess I'll start with Mr. Wernick first, since you're in the room, and then move on to the next witness. I guess my first question is around the fact, around the issue of the leaks that are happening from, we suspect, CSIS, but of course that question is still open and is yet to be solved. We heard from the other witness here today also that there could be an agenda that might that is being pursued perhaps by the leaker. I also wanted to know from your perspective of whether you think there could be an agenda of a foreign state involved in this whole matter that is before us right now. Do you think there is a greater agenda to disrupt our democracy that might be in place? And if so, what are your comments and maybe some suggestions around that?
I'd be entirely speculating about the motives of somebody we don't know the identity of as to why they leaked. I don't think it'd be responsible to speculate on that. It can be accidental, it can be deliberate, it can be any number of motivations. I think that what I would be concerned about is the end effect of that, which is it's done damage to CSIS's reputation with our Five Eyes partners, and they will now think of it as a less secure institution, and that's permanent damage. If the Americans and the Brits start to withhold documents from us by, well, let's not send them to the Canadians, we'll never know.
That's interesting. In terms of the foreign actors involved, do you think that they could be intentionally highlighting a divide existing currently?
I think the point about foreign actors is disinformation campaigns, and that one of the things that is really, really hard work for the security intelligence community is to sort out information that's collected and decide what's reliable, what's corroborated. There is a possibility that it is disinformation. Mr. Johnston wrote about some of these. I'm aware of incidents where the media ran with stories that were generated by foreign intelligence agencies. I'm not blaming them for that, but that's the information they had, and that's one of the reasons I think it's important that a wider community of people have the security clearances, to look at information and to be more skeptical and wonder about whether this is authentic, corroborated, or could it be spin and disinformation by a malign actor.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. In the previous interaction with the Conservative member, you were talking about where the communication link is perhaps broken. This was brought up in the report by the Right Honourable David Johnston. As the former clerk of the Privy Council, part of your role as Deputy Minister to the Prime Minister, can you speak to a little bit more about how we could correct those broken lines, how we can fill those gaps in?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that can be one element of the comprehensive foreign interference legislation when it finally comes forward. Having read Mr. Johnston's report and thinking about it, I think this committee could recommend to the government, or you could bring it forward as an amendment when you finally have a bill in front of you, to legislate the role of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, put it in statute, identify its powers and identify its accountabilities, and give the NSIA a statutory accountability to make sure that the right top secret information gets to the right people at the right time. Give that person accountability for the flow of information so this kind of broken communication doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. And to our other witness, Mr. Matrovoka, you said some very bold things in your introductory remarks. I wanted to give you the opportunity also to give some recommendations to this committee as to how we could better work with our agencies. You said that there perhaps is different motives that are behind the way they operate, perhaps how the political side should be operating. What are some ways we can improve the situation so that we don't have these vulnerabilities to foreign state actors?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important. The first thing I would recommend to you is to show less deference to security officials that appear before you at parliamentary committees like this. I was particularly shocked by the Bloc Québécois deference to security officials, because if they had any understanding of the history of Canada's security services, they would know that there was a McConnell Commission of Inquiry struck that showed that in Quebec, the former RCMP security service was responsible for a slew of illegal activities that resulted in the creation of CSIS itself. The other recommendation I would suggest to committee members is begin to learn something about the very institutions that you, and the history of the very institutions that you are probing. I made a point in my statement of pointing out that a federal court judge found in 2020, not in 1960, not in 1980, but in 2020, that CSIS routinely lies and breaks the law. He is not the only federal court judge to have found that CSIS acts in this manner. I would also suggest that in the future, for future reference, you read my book to get a more intimate understanding how intelligence services in Canada operate, and that you be much less deferential to them and bow before them, bow before their expertise. And a particular, so I'll leave it at that.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Madame Gaudreau.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a number of questions for Mr. Warnick. First, about an hour ago or less, we heard the following argument that an independent public inquiry could shed light and provide legitimate recommendations from a legislative standpoint, and also with respect to that registry of foreign actors. There was something that was raised about partisanship, however, and I want to reiterate that. The Bloc Québécois' objective is to shed some light here and to restore public trust. I'd like to hear you speak to Mr. Johnston's report as to how we can rectify things when it comes to trust in our democracy. Where do things stand? That's quite the question. I think we have a problem now with our processes and democratic institutions, and we need to work together to restore this trust and act quickly prior to the next elections. There are about over 200 days left within this parliament before the next elections. That's not much time. And my argument, and I reiterate it, is that if you do obtain your inquiry and it is a minority parliament, you could force that. It's easy to do. What will you do, when it comes during that inquiry? In parallel, you can also consider a bill, debate it, amend it, and have something in place to defend the next elections. I appreciate your comments because at the end of the day, given the various ways in which this is being addressed, I'm seeing things tighten up, and there seems to be this through line that we need to work in parallel on a number of issues. You understand that to shed light on this, and if we don't have a public independent inquiry, then of course we as a committee want to seek documents that can help us, support us in our work. Earlier, the previous witness mentioned that it was practically impossible to have access through the law clerk to this information. So I'd like to know where things stand. When we want to get some documents that may be redacted but could be useful in the course of our work, what should we do? I think you can have an inquiry, but not a fully public inquiry. That's a sentence many people have been stating because of the issue of documents and sources of information. We want to harm that process. So there needs to be a hybrid solution. I am not a lawyer, but the Rouleau Commission model on the occupation in Ottawa might be a model. There may be a hybrid model envisaged where some aspects are public and some aspects are in camera. Okay, but as far as you're concerned, this seeking of documents that we have here, we were told that the law clerk was not going to be able to share that with us because of a lack of security clearance or not a high enough security clearance. But you know as well as I do, you know that getting a security clearance takes a long time. So where do things stand? Look, I hesitate to recommend a specific mechanism, but there is a link between access to information and obtaining security clearance. You can't have one without the other. So judges or justices, the Parliamentary Committee on an ICOP, mechanisms for some kind of feedback, all of that has gone through the process to obtain. And what Mr. Johnston has identified, and I think it's very important, is also provincial governments. I think it's time now to broaden the number of people who would have access to this type of intelligence or information. But you have to subject this to the clearance process. To do that, it would be a good idea for the premiers to have access, that there should be perhaps some individuals within provincial governments apparatus, if you will, machinery of provincial governments, because at this point there is a threat that we are facing as Canadians, as Quebecers, and we need to enhance our defenses. I have just a few seconds left here, and we can continue this discussion later, but what would be your priorities? Could you set them out when we talk about legislation, to legislate, to have an inquiry, to clean things up in these various bodies? We have a few seconds left, and then we can continue in the next turn. The idea of an inquiry, no inquiry, has become a political issue. It will be addressed by politicians. For my part, I say that the purpose of an inquiry, so the inquiry is not the end in and of itself. The final end is to have defenses in place, and for that to be the case, you need to legislate. So it's not about having an inquiry and then legislating. I think both things can be done in parallel. I myself am convinced that an inquiry is essential.
Madame Blaney.
Thank you very much, Madame Blaney.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Wernick, I'm going to come to you first, and thank you for coming back so soon. It's good to see you again. I guess this is really about addressing the point of privilege, which I think is incredibly important. And what we've heard very clearly through multiple sources is that Mr. Chong was not made aware of issues soon enough. I think that's an important component of this. We also know that the processes to get that information to Mr. Chong seem to get stuck somewhere in top secret email world and all of these different challenges. So I know you speak a lot about legislation and those types of changes. I'm just wondering, when you look at this system that we have in place, which is currently failing us in a way that it builds a sense of distrust, and you mentioned this not only with Canadians, but potentially with our Five Eyes partners. I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit from your perspective of the work you've done, if you have any process or legislative ideas around how does this information get to the people who need it in a way that is timely, but also honoring the reality that it has to be substantive enough to be shared before anything else. So I'll leave you to that.
Yeah, no, it's a big question, and I do think Mr. Johnston's report is very helpful on this. We have a problem. Hindsight is always better than foresight, so we now know things that we could have known earlier. We didn't. So now is the time. It's now 2023. It's time to act. I think part of the problem that Mr. Johnston identifies is that nobody felt fully accountable for, and it's one of those issues, and I'm familiar with others, where it's simply other people assumed somebody else was doing something, and there wasn't a clear accountability. I would legislate the role of the NSIA. I would give them a fixed term, 5 years, so that somebody goes into that job. They can, they've made a choice to stay in it for a while. The turnover was not helpful that happened over the last few years. And I'd make that person accountable for where top secret and above information goes within the government.
Well, thank you for that, and I think that is pretty apparent in the information that we've seen. Is that it is and it seems to be a bit of a human condition that you hope that somebody else is dealing with the issue at the time. But we did hear previous testimony from our last witnesses, just talking about the importance of the process of sending and receiving intelligence and making sure that the people who are sending it are actually knowing what the people on the other side need and if it's useful to them. And I think that's an interesting gap in the process. And I'm just wondering if you could share any thoughts about that based on your years of service. And I really do appreciate your idea of having that level of accountability. So I just want to wonder where the intersection is between those two roles.
Well, it's a tough one, and I cover this a little bit in my book, if you don't mind the plug for that. The problem, if you go at the very, very top, if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, the Clerk of the Privy Council, is that you are at the end of a funnel of so many issues running in parallel. Your job is constant multitasking. You cannot read everything. You can't meet everybody. You can't see everybody. So there are choices about time management and choices about what gets sent to the Prime Minister, what the Prime Minister has time to read, all the 7 roles that a Prime Minister plays and so on. That's an accountability of the clerk on the public service side, and it's accountability of the Chief of Staff on the political side. But I guess, what I want to say is you will not be able to just apply some rule book or algorithm that will sort it for you and get it right every time. There will be lapses of judgment because you cannot see in advance this thing turned out to be as important as it did, and you may be sending stuff which turns out to be trivial and unimportant. So the point about intelligence services is it's constantly exercising judgment about information. I think I heard the tail end of that conversation. What's reliable? What's important? There are 200 countries in the world. Are we going to follow every single one of them in detail? No, there are some are more important than others, and so on. So, and that's why people get these jobs of National Security Advisor or Clerk or Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister to exercise those kinds of judgments and put processes in place that reduce the risk of gaps and error. And, we have learned from this set of, this exercise that there are gaps that need to be addressed.
So, in terms of having the NSIA accountability increase, is that something we need legislation to do, or is that something that can be a decision made by the leadership right now to see move forward?
Well, my understanding based on news stories is there already was an order in council which directed the agencies, or at least CSIS, if I correct me if I got this wrong, to pass information to the Minister of Public Safety. You will have to make a judgment as legislators whether that accountability should flow through the Minister of Public Safety or flow through the Prime Minister. In a sense, everything ends up on the Prime Minister's desk. That's a legislative design issue that you can debate when you have a bill in front of you. In that sense, the NSIA works for the Prime Minister, not for the Minister of Public Safety, but acts as a coordinator for all of those agencies. Anyway, I don't want to get deep in the weeds on governance, but these are the kind of things where writing laws and setting up the processes and institutions will affect how people then behave and exercise judgment, until you change the legislation again. We've rewritten our national security legislation roughly every 5 to 6 years because the world keeps changing, and no doubt we'll have to do it again.
Thank you. Perfect timing.
Thank you so much. We will now enter Mr. Berthold, suivi par Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Berthold.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wernick, for being here with us. I have not read your book, Mr. Wernick, so I won't be referring to it. Comment inaudible? I have read a few lines in English. I've learned of the couple last few years, but that aside, Mr. Wernick, you said that the memo on Michael Chong should have gone directly to the Prime Minister. Let's go hypothetical here for a moment. When you were the clerk of the Privy Council, what would have been your reaction had you been dealing with this kind of thing, that a memo of this importance had not been sent to the Prime Minister? I think that any backward-facing exercise is always involves asking that question: how did that happen, and how can we correct this to avoid the risk of this recurring? But would you have launched some kind of internal investigation to find out what exactly wasn't working? What would have happened? An email exchange, some kind of communication within PCO? There is a range of formal, informal, very formal mechanisms. It's an exercise of learning some lessons from this. You said that note, you said it yourself, that note should have been on the Prime Minister's desk. Would it have been worthwhile to have a formal mechanism in place to rectify this? I'm simply trying to grasp how we could have reacted to avoid this type of situation occurring. Yes, I think a number of steps have been taken. Mr. Johnston interviewed 32 individuals, all the people involved. There's an annex of documentation that I haven't seen. Neither have I, said Mr. Berthold. And that would be then sent to the review parliamentary agency, and that is then available to opposition party leaders. I think the exercise of reflecting on how that happened, we have all the evidence needed for that. I always focus on the future, the challenges in the coming few months, in the coming few years, how to address this type of situation. You recommended previously to this committee that the commissioner responsible for any future public inquiry perhaps not be a Canadian. Given the increasing appeals from parliamentarians and from Canadians in general on this issue, who should be responsible for choosing this commissioner? If you do obtain your inquiry,
the car, what does the dog then do? Si vous avez votre...
If you do manage to get the inquiry, it's really important who does preside. And I say that with all due respect. In the past, there have been investigations that were not very useful, and others had enormous impact. So the choice of the commissioner, the staff, all of that is very important. At the end of the day, everyone looks at the judges or justices as being some kind of magical solution because they have the training, they have the independence. But we've all seen attacks on judges. To have someone that has the training required, and I only have 1 minute left, Mr. Berthold. I think I'm slightly off, or slightly offside on the question here. I'm not saying who should be the judge, but who should choose the judge. Should that be the Prime Minister, his office, Parliament? Because we have a credibility issue here, a breach of trust, because there was a decision made unilaterally by the government. This is an example where, to restore the trust of Canadians in our institutions and political processes, we need to see our politicians working together. If it were my role to make a recommendation, I would say it will always be the Prime Minister it will be up to the Prime Minister to make a recommendation to Cabinet, and then following consultation with opposition party leaders. Consensus, achieving perfect consensus, I'm not sure you'll find a Canadian that would not be subjected to. That's why you were suggesting someone completely external? Yeah, there's a long list of Australian and British prime ministers who've worked in very similar circumstances. Perhaps we could recruit someone who would be truly, really independent. Thank you.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to both the witnesses for being here today. Welcome back to PROC, and it's great to have your testimony. Mr. Wernick, perhaps I'll start with you. I have a sort of series of questions. Some of them are short answers, so hopefully you can keep your answers brief. As former clerk of the Privy Council, I assume that you're fairly knowledgeable about security clearance and dealing with sensitive top secret information. So I wanted to ask you, what security clearance would you need to review the highly confidential annex to Johnston's report?
I don't know the answer to that. From reading the text, it sounds like a lot of it is top secret. In the hierarchy of clearances, it's top secret or above. So I don't know the answer. That's a question to ask the government.
Okay. I think there's a level higher than top secret, which is enhanced top secret. Is that correct?
That's for some of the most sensitive electronic interception, yes.
Okay, and do members of NSICOP and CIRA have that level of top security, enhanced top security clearance, as far as you know?
I'm not a reliable source on that. I believe they do. But.
Okay. Do you happen to know how long a security clearance lasts?
It depends on the level of clearance. There's a level of the more lower level ones last longer than the higher level ones. And that's, again, a question to ask the government. My recollection is that they're generally about 5 years or some major change in your life. If you get married or you move or something, change job or whatever, you may have to renew them. But I think they're roughly 5 years.
So if there's a material change to one's circumstances, then you'd have to undergo that security screening
just
again.
like the disclosures to the Commissioner of Lobbying and the Ethics Commissioner.
Would former members of cabinet from a different administration have the level of security clearance required, do you think, to review the top secret annex for Johnston's report?
I don't know that. They would have gone through a process of vetting, which is a different matter. The four-way checks on sort of personal history, financial history, legal troubles, and so on. Those happen to everybody who is a potential nominee to cabinet. So anybody who would have been considered for cabinet appointment would have gone through a background check at the time, but again, those have to be renewed every so often if something has changed.
Like if you got married, for example.
Yeah, or moved into opposition or whatever.
Got
I mean,
it.
there's all kinds of reasons why you would. And again, it's not an algorithm with a simple rule. There's judgment required. So.
Got it. In Mr. Johnston's report, he concludes, and I quote, "No examples have been identified of ministers, the Prime Minister of the offices knowingly or negligently failing to act on intelligence, advice, or recommendations." So, Mr. Wernick, in your opinion, would party leaders, especially ones that have publicly expressed critical views of the findings of Johnston's report, should they not review the confidential annex containing the intelligence when given the opportunity to do so?
I think I heard Mr. Wilczynski say this. I think having more knowledge is always better than having less knowledge, and that if you have the opportunity, and not everybody does, to have access to that kind of information, that you should go through the clearance process and you should be willing to take that information. I don't agree that that silences you or makes it impossible to do your job in opposition. We can talk about that if you'd like.
Great. Does it concern you that opposition leaders, and I discount or I exclude the NDP because I think their leader has agreed to undergo the necessary security clearance and has expressed a clear desire to review that annex. Does it concern you that opposition leaders, specifically the Bloc and the Conservative Party leaders, are formulating criticisms of the government's response but not willing to do so based on the facts when they have access to them?
Well, I think I reframe it and say more parliamentarians should go through the vetting process and get higher security clearances. That narrowing it just to the members of NSICOP is not sufficient anymore. There should be ways of having more people go through security clearances and get access to higher level information.
And you've said very clearly that this doesn't necessarily silence you, that just as with David Johnston's report, he's given very clear conclusions and made observations and even been able to say things that I think do promote public trust to some degree. Yeah. So if that's the overall objective here, can you speak a little bit more to, why this notion of, knowing the truth is somehow a trap to silence me is not really a completely valid argument?
Well, this is a debate we had in 2016 and 2017 when the bill to create NSI COP was before Parliament. The chair will remember some of those discussions, and the same argument was made that opposition members couldn't be part of this committee because they couldn't then be opposition members. And we said, well, they make it work in the United States, they make it work in the United Kingdom, they make it work in Germany, they make it work in France. There is a way to do that. I think the only thing that you would be expected to keep silent about is the factoids of specific intelligence that you were made aware of. But you would be able to, you could make arguments, you could be critical, you could make proposals. You would not be silenced in your role as opposition. And I think furthermore, if you were aware, if you became aware through intelligence sources that a media story had been planted by a foreign intelligence service as a disinformation campaign, and you decided to be a bit more circumspect and not run with it, isn't that a good thing?
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. What we're dealing with today is what we've been dealing with for the last few months. We really want to shed light on this, but there are many things in our way. I heard what you've said. Let's focus on the future. Let's give everyone time to do this. And you said public investigation, and you also talked about legislating. And we want to be constructive. We want to reassure people that the message is being sent, that we need to act. You've got a lot of experience here. What kind of clues would you have for us, or tips? Tomorrow morning, you'll be in caucuses, and you'll have direct access to your leaders. I recommend that government members clearly state to the Prime Minister, please rise in the House of Commons and commit to a bill in September. And you can go to your leaders and recommend to your leaders, okay, we're going to cooperate with the government in the sense of debating, amending, and passing that particular bill as soon as possible. Well, what else? That to me is the key. The key. But there are other things that need to be done at the same time. In parallel, if you do get your inquiry, that will lead to lessons learned. Mr. Johnston can continue his work. He is wise. He's a law professor. He's a lawyer. His recommendations will certainly be very useful. Questions like intelligence to evidence, there's nothing new to that. We discussed that in developing the bill, the Harper government bill in 2015. The same subjects arose in drafting that bill, the Trudeau government's bill in 2017. So we have everything we need. Now it's about political will. That's what's missing. To make decisions, draft a bill, and use your time as parliamentarians to study it, to hear from witnesses, amend, improve, and pass something. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dan Blaney.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Warnick, I'm really fascinated by what you said, that there should be more parliamentarians going through the process, getting that security clearance and accessing the information. I'm just wondering, in that process, do you perceive members of Parliament needing better training around national security and how to protect the nation's interests? And I do think it's an interesting point, because it means a higher level of accountability for us as well as parliamentarians, those of us who know that information and how to carry it. And hopefully it would take us from a very strongly partisan reality into one that is a little bit more focused on the nation's good. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about training that MPs may require to do that work.
Well, there would be decisions about how, like, there's 338 of you, and there's also the Senate, and so how wide that would need to be, at what level, that's a question of design, which you can come to some agreement on among the parties as to how far to go. Of course, there'd have to be training. With the accountability comes the possibility of sanctions. If when I don't have those clearances anymore, but they came with an accountability that if I divulged secrets that I had read or seen, I could go to jail. I could be fined. I could lose my job. I could lose my security clearances. In the public service, if you lose your security clearance, it's tantamount to being fired because you can't do the work anymore. So you'd have to, that's a tricky area. What would be the sanctions on a rogue parliamentarian who decided to leak, And that happens in the States, and that happens in the UK. So there's a lot to work through there. But I think limiting it as narrowly as we're doing now isn't working for us anymore.
And then my last question to you quickly is if you have a name or two that you'd like to recommend for leading a public inquiry, we'd love it. But if not, what would be the criteria that you think would be key?
Well, I mean, there is an art to driving inquiries to conclusion. I mean, there's an organizational skill in sort of, getting the work done, for sure. And I think that's one of the reasons people like judges. They're used to running courtrooms. But in this particular instance, I think if you don't have some familiarity or life experience or background in the world of security and intelligence, you might not really know the right questions to ask and the right lines to pursue. So that, that's the part. I'm sure actually my colleague might want to comment on that. The problem with, if you go to people that are deeply inside the security and intelligence community, do they have the objectivity about those institutions that they grew up and work in? So it's not easy to find somebody who has enough knowledge but enough distance to do a good job, which is why I'm kind of inclined to go to Canberra and find the National Security Advisor to the Australian government, but I'm only being semi-facetious there. It's not easy to find that kind of that skill set. Each inquiry has its own subject area and its own purpose. Why I go to Australia and the UK is that they use the British Westminster system of government, and the accountability of ministers and prime ministers is very familiar territory to anybody who works in the UK or Australia. If you go to Americans or French or Germans, they have a completely different software.
The BPP did not go off because it did not start. And Mrs. Blaney, you're one who's really good to me, most part, minus about 3 examples, which I always say. But I am going to ask Mr. Mitrovica just to comment on it because Mr. Wernick had suggested that. Did you want to, Mr. Mitrovica? You're on mute.
I found it astounding that the former clerk of the Privy Council would suggest that Canada forfeit its sovereignty and appoint a Australian or a British member to appoint this much-needed public inquiry. Just astounding to me that he would even suggest that either facetiously or half seriously. And it's no wonder he's out of his job.
Well, I will just say this was actually an interesting conversation, at least for myself as the chair of Procedure and House Affairs. And I am inclined to ask you, Mr. Wernick, that suggesting that more people should have clearance, this is something that Procedure and House Affairs has been quite seized with. Is it your suggestion that Procedure and House Affairs committee members should be asking for that clearance?
I don't have a clear sense of that. I mean, a lot of the substantive matters, to bring inside the tent, at least to some degree.
Very interesting. Really good food for thought. With that, I want to, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank you, Mr. Wernick, and thank you, Mr. Mitrovica, for your reappearances at Procedure and House Affairs. If something comes to mind, please do not hesitate to share it with the clerk. We will have it translated into both official languages. We're looking at some kind of an Aeroplan miles kind of thing. So the more appearances you have, maybe you'll get a certificate or a gold star. So we are noting that you have been good to us.
Listening today.
So with that, have yourselves a great day. Committee members, we are meeting back again at 6:30. We have 2 more panels with 2 witnesses each. We will see you tonight. Everyone, keep well and safe. Thank you.